thank you very much, Sally, and I'd really like to thank the organisation for inviting me along here tonight. I'm not sure how this is going to go as a forum, but I guess we'll see. I would like to say welcome to all of you new electric vehicle users, and I say that as a former submariner who served on an Oberon class submarine. So I've been doing it for about 40 or 50 years. I'm wondering if anyone else can beat that particular record. I can't just try to remember how many ampere hours the two batteries were on an Oberon class submarine. But I do remember we used to, just going along slowly, it was about 280 amps used to draw, and at full speed it was something like 5 megawatts. So anyone got a car like that, come and have a talk to me later and I'll be impressed. Look, so I do have a background in electrical matters. I've crawled around on the top of submarine batteries, measuring electrolytic capacity and actually managing and maintaining lead-acid cells, and in fact controlling the electrics as what was done once as a first motor and watchkeeper in charge of the submarine's electric system. So I do have a technical background. I'm not a typical politician, more of an engineering type, and as such there's some risk that I might tell the truth tonight, okay, so just need to be careful about that. My introduction to electric vehicles proper was probably through the 2019 Senate inquiry into electric vehicles, which, and I'll have to give credit to Tim Storer, who I know had also come along for initiating that particular inquiry. That particular inquiry showed me, or opened my eyes to the fact that the future is electric vehicles. Huge productivity gains because of the efficiency of the vehicles. If you look at the life cycle or the life costs of owning an electric vehicle, despite the higher upfront costs at the present moment, there are still clear advantages there. I also have to look at things from a whole range of different perspectives, so I also look at it from a fuel security perspective, where we only have currently about 23 days, 24 days of fuel available to us, and the use or transition across to electric vehicles is most useful even in a national security sense by reducing the dependency on ICEs and fuels. It also helps our balance of trade, because we predominantly import all of our fuel as well. So it's good in that regard. And that's before we start talking about emissions reductions and the lack of pollutants that come from the vehicles. All of that was brought to my attention during that particular inquiry. Now, since then, I've gone on to do a few things. One of them is to support the bringing the production of electric vehicles to South Australia. I'm very proud to have twisted the government's arm using my crossbench leverage to get $5 million towards ACE Vehicles, who are conducting a vehicle-to-grid trial with that money, and indeed then starting up a production facility here in Adelaide for electric vehicles. And Mark Hayes around somewhere. Where's every raise your hand? Yep, okay. Mark is one of the key participants in the supply chain for that, and maybe at some stage we might be able to throw some questions to Mark in relation to where that project is sitting. But we certainly, if you look at the budget, you will find a $5 million line item in there for South Australia for electric vehicle manufacturing. So that's a really good thing. I've also been quite loud in criticising the South Australian government for its proposal to introduce a road user tax. This is not the time to do that. This is the time to be providing incentive to switch across to electric vehicles. Ultimately, there will need to be a road user tax. The roads aren't free. We need to be mindful of the need to pay our way. But we'd like to see that road user tax brought in slowly over time. I won't be too critical with the state government. Look, I'm independent. I give praise where it's due, and I also criticise and highlight deficiencies where they exist. The South Australian government does have a plan, and I think you can find it on the internet, that lays out how it's going to transition across to electric vehicles over time. And I think if you haven't seen that, you should go looking for that. And certainly my office can help people if they're not able to find where that is on the net. The other thing I've just started getting myself involved in is also Formula E. Now meeting with some of the players in that area, and looking at how I can use my influence to get some traction in relation to that. So I started early, and I'm still going. So that's kind of where things are at. Look, I really do believe electric vehicles are the future. I've said in the Senate on a few occasions where you have people in government saying, we don't pick winners. Well, you know what? You don't have to pick the winners, because the car companies have already made their decisions about this. One of the reasons I'm supporting the ACE initiative is because I also think we should be involved in that transition from a worldwide perspective. I get really frustrated with the fact that we export iron ore instead of steel. I get really frustrated that we export lithium instead of batteries. We're not doing the value add here in this country. Rossi Boots, some of you may have seen just in the papers this week. Rossi Boots here in Adelaide, thankfully, have found a way to continuing the manufacture of boots. Back in 2014, the Army gave a boot contract to Indonesia. They did so on the basis that it was 15% cheaper than the Australian bid. At a Senate inquiry, Rossi Boots provided evidence that said, when you add on our minimum wages, our superannuation guarantee, our leave loadings, our long service leave, our environmental standards, our occupational health and safety standards, all of those sorts of things, when they're added on, was tallied up to 25%, a 25% premium on their manufacturing cost. And so you have a government who says, who forces companies, and I actually say that all those things are good things, but makes companies comply with all of those statutory requirements. And then they look and say, but the Indonesians can do it cheaper. And it is really short-sightedness. And I think the same thing happens in relation to this value add. We've got to stop exporting rocks. I don't mind us exporting rocks. I just don't like us just exporting rocks. And that's something I continue to press at every opportunity, because I think it's really important. And it's that value add where you do end up with a product that sells for a lot more, but you also create a whole bunch of jobs along the way. And that seems to be lost on the free trade extremists that particularly sit inside the Liberal Party. I'm happy to talk about things that are wrong with the Labor Party as well, but in that particular regard, there are some extremists that talk about competitive advantage and so forth, but almost in a purist sense. Talking about purist economic theories here in Australia, when we're dealing with countries like China, who have a completely different political regime to what we have here. So I'd like to see us doing a lot more here, just in general, and that's one of the reasons why I backed the electric vehicle manufacturing here in Adelaide. I've probably said enough at this point in time, but I'm happy to take any questions that you may have about what's happening in Canberra, to a certain extent what I know about what's happening in South Australia. I suspect on the technical stuff you probably are much more savvy than what I am, but I do know what a diode is and a capacitor, and I'm actually an electronic technician. So, Sally, I might point out, by the way, with the COVID arrangements, there's a little bit of irony in the fact that you're going to share that particular microphone, and I'm the person in the room that had COVID. Okay, so with some immunity at least, I would think.
I'm not sure how much of this is question, how much of it is comment, but the one of the issues really is the lost revenue to the federal government on petrol tax and fuel excise, and this is touted as a road user tax, but it's not. That money goes into general revenue, and I think something of the order of 40 to 45% of it is actually spent on roads. The rest goes to fund other things, including hospitals. And the point that I wanted to make tonight was that if we go to electric vehicles, it's my understanding that the cost of pollution-related illness to the community is greater than the cost of road accidents. So that there will be a huge net benefit in going electric to the federal government's and state government's coffers. In coming up with the road user charge, it appears that they've tried to come up with a figure which roughly equates to the whole of that money that they've lost from petrol excise being replaced without any offset for the advantages that they're going to reap from the health benefits, as you said, also the balance of trade, and the fact that we don't have a problem with fuel supply, in that it was 23 days of fuel, which is pretty scary, really. So you guys sort of comment on whether anyone has really looked at the fact that along with this loss of revenue comes a gain to revenue, but on a different purse. So it needs balancing.
Yeah, look, I think you raise a complex formula that probably does need to be looked into. I will say that a lot of taxes are targeted in a user pays kind of way, and so I think road users will always be expected to contribute in some way towards the roads. Again, I say there should not be a road user tax at this point in time for electric vehicles. One of the difficulties you're going to have with politics, and I won't tell you who told me this, but it was someone on the Labor side when we were discussing electric cars, and we've got the Tesla people here. You know, the Teslas are relatively expensive vehicles, so generally owned by relatively well-off people, and a Labor philosophy, and this is a barrier that you users will have to confront. The Labor philosophy is why do we reduce the cost to people who are well off, and transfer the burden across to people who are less well off. That's that sort of socialist tinge to the way the Labor Party works. That's something you'll have to deal with. That's the way they think.
Cheap cars pollute.
Well, if I can just jump the queue with an additional comment about that road user charge at the 4 cents a kilometre flagged for South Australia. Most of you would know I drive a very small production electric car, an IME, so the smallest one you can get and the cheapest one in Australia at the moment, and has been for a long time. But when I calculated my mileage, if I did the annual average kilometres at 4 cents a kilometre, and my car's the size of a Toyota Yaris, a Mitsubishi Mirage, a small runabout, a Suzuki Swift or a Prius C, similar to any of those kind of cars. At 4 cents a kilometre, my tax, as well as the additional purchase price, still in that bottom end of the market, they're still more expensive to buy then a petrol car, it worked out to double the equivalent fuel excise paid by an efficient small petrol car. So that at that 4 cents a kilometre, there's real inequity there, and it doesn't encourage the uptake of efficient, resource sustainable vehicles, because the tax is almost half of the running cost of, the fuel cost at 42 cents a litre. So there's a flat rate without taking into account either the economy or the emissions or some other factor or the mass of the vehicle is not a fair playing field. The way we've become used to with petrol vehicles, if you buy something smaller that consumes less, you pollute less and you pay less tax. So that was our obvious inequity with it.
Okay, so here's where I might give some political advice to you. It's clear you've got arguments
Yes.
against the tax, perhaps in the short term, and some sort of modification in the long term. Some of you may view that there ought to be no tax in the long term either. The great way our system works is that we have a parliament, and in order to bring in these sorts of taxes, there will be the requirement to pass laws. Look, I don't keep a close watch on the South Australian Parliament. I'm busy enough in the federal parliament. The way it works in the federal parliament, of course, the lower house, the House of Reps, always has the numbers. That's how the Liberal Party form government, because they have a majority in the lower house. We then, any law that comes in has to pass the lower house, and it will if the government wants it to. Comes to the Senate. They need 39 votes in the Senate to get legislation through. They only have 36 senators. And that's where you'll see those who want change, those who want amendments or laws rejected, know how to firstly work out when the Labor Party is opposing and the Greens are opposing, and then it leaves the decision to the crossbench. And that's when I get lobbied very strongly by people. It's also my opportunity to get $5 million here, $5 million there. I will never vote for something I don't believe in. But a lot of legislation is white or black, or some legislation is white, some of it's black. A lot of it is grey, and the greyness can be taken away by amendments to make the legislation better, to make it softer or harder depending on the circumstances. And occasionally looking at the finance minister or the relevant minister and saying, "Oh, I could be convinced," and then things that are important to me for South Australia might come into play. I don't feel bad about that, because in the lower house, membership of the lower house is made up of each. There's one member for each about 110,000 people, and in South Australia that means we have, representing us in the lower house in federal parliament, 10 MPs. Sydney has 50. Brisbane has probably 40, and Melbourne similar sorts of numbers. It's dominated by the East Coast, and the whole system was set up so that the Senate was the state's house. We have 12 senators, South Australian senators in the Senate. We have so does Victoria, so does New South Wales, so does Western Australia. It's set up like that so that the smaller states couldn't get run over the top of by the lower house. So, but ultimately, the Senate is about numbers, and indeed the MLC here, the Legislative Council here, also needs to pass legislation, not just the Legislative Assembly. So the Legislative Council, is the equivalent of the Senate here in the state, and the government doesn't have a majority in the Legislative Council. And my understanding is that Peter Malinauskas is not inclined to support the tax. I doubt if the Greens will support the tax. Two SA Best candidates are against. I don't think the government have the numbers to get it through. So that's a nice thing in the way that the Parliament is currently configured. So, and if you're satisfied that that's where the numbers lie, then you probably don't have to do too much work. But you need to be making sure you are connected into the Legislative Council because of that balance of power situation that the South Australian government doesn't have the ability to simply rubber stamp legislation going through both houses. So that's just a tip for you. It is serious when you turn up on election day and vote, and pay attention not just to the premiers or the prospective premiers. Also think about the constitution of the Legislative Council.
Senator, my feeling on this fuel tax is that like you say, it's too early. I feel that what we should do, because electric vehicles are only like 0.6% of the total traffic on the roads in Australia, it's definitely too early, but my feeling is that we should wait and bring in a different system for all vehicles. Just change the whole system for all vehicles and base it on maybe kilometres travelled, the weight of the vehicle, and also the amount of emissions coming from the vehicle. Now, also the fact that we're only just going to have electric vehicles new. We might have nuclear vehicles, we might have steamed vehicles coming back. Every vehicle's got to be included in this new system. So that's my feeling on it anyway.
Yeah, look, and I'll just take up on your point. One of the dangers of the current way forward in relation to this road user tax is that Victoria is proposing a tax. New South Wales is proposing a tax. So too is South Australia. And we're going to have, it's like the narrow gauge situation with that we had across Australia with railways, a standard gauge and narrow gauge, and that's where we're headed. And part of the problem here is that this is because the federal government hasn't taken this by the reins and are not leading. And I wrote to so Minister Taylor and Angus Taylor, who's the Energy Minister, and McCormack, and basically pointed this out, saying, hey, you're going to have this narrow gauge, standard gauge problem if you don't pay attention. So I'd like to actually see that shift to the federal sphere, and when that occurs, having all the right considerations, consultations, both with departments moving through to when the legislation is passed, when the legislation is presented to the Senate, that we would inquire and make sure that all of the sorts of things you are talking about are in fact considered properly. I won't go to nuclear vehicles. As a crossbencher, I just got to focus on what's here and now, and just 4 to 5 years out. But there are, of course, other people who are always thinking well ahead of me. So, and that's a good thing.
We haven't had a response yet.
Yeah. So we haven't. We're waiting for the ministers to respond to my correspondence, and I'd be happy to share that with your organisation, actually.
Yes, well, the AEVA's national position has been that perhaps a road user tax further down the track, much further, not while electric cars are more expensive than ICE cars, because that just is a huge disincentive for uptake. However, and then phase it in, but include all vehicles, so that petrol vehicles, the polluting vehicles that actually cost our health and environment budget more money, are paying fuel excise, and gradually, an introductory rate of if it's a road user charge. There may well be completely different ways of doing it. I've heard there are ways of measuring the kilowatts into the car, like energy consumed, and making equivalent way of working that out instead. There may well be other ideas. There might be some in the room, but it's not only that inequity of a flat rate for all vehicles, which is not how we work now. It's the timing of it. Do we need that much money back when it's not all spent on roads now? The savings. Personally, as an asthmatic, I cost the government less in asthma treatment after 7 years of driving electric and not going to buy petrol. And it's only, fortunately for COVID, if I had to go and buy petrol now, I could wear a mask and gloves and I'd feel more comfortable doing that. I know other people have those anecdotal stories about it already. So we don't want, there has to be a way of taking those savings into the picture somehow. Now, does anyone else have comments on, yes, Don?
Here or there?
No, come up here, we need to hear you. I think this is a pretty big topic for the night.
Yes, well, I've got a different viewpoint on some of these matters.
Okay.
We love that.
Good, I'm very pleased to hear it. Now, as I see it, the new tax will penalise EV drivers, especially country drivers. I'm a country person. And they travel much larger distances. And the businesses require much larger distances. It will have an effect on visitors from states that don't have a tax. What would they think of that? Now, they say that we should pay for the roads, the people who use it. And I say, well, okay, who are the users? Every person in this country is a user. It's a big part of our existence as a first world country. They are necessary for the country to operate. Absolutely needed for public transport, government vehicles, police, ambulance, fire brigade, construction, manufacture, tourism, everything, clothing, food, industry, farming and supermarkets. They all require roads and infrastructure. Now, if that is the case, then my view is that the general revenue should pay for it. Because everybody uses this infrastructure, not just motorists. I think it's totally wrong. And the fuel tax paid on ICE vehicles goes to general revenue. Only a part of it comes back to roads. What if we took a bit of that away and put that into infrastructure and so on? Maybe ICE vehicles might pay a little more for their petrol and they might buy more electric vehicles. What a good idea. Now, wouldn't that be something towards our country and make it work more efficiently? I'll give you a copy of this. It's a lot more than that.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether to take that as a comment or a question, but I think, and this is where I play in Canberra, in order to find solutions, there will be compromise to deal with all the different players that you've talked about. In the case of road users, there are direct users, people who take their vehicle and use it for their own purpose. Then there is, of course, public. There are public vehicles like ambulances and police cars, as you mentioned, and their contribution will, in fact, come from the general taxpayer. The people who are driving trucks, they will recover that cost through freight charges that, in effect, the user does end up paying when they buy goods and so forth. I think it's quite complicated, but it's a little bit like, I just throw caution when and I know you weren't saying this, you were saying it's a general cost. I just throw caution when you try and stand out as someone who is special, that doesn't deserve any tax at all. That's all often hard to sell in the halls of Parliament House, and you just need to be a little bit measured and try and find the pathway through the politics. But your points are all highly valid, and I'm on side. Absolutely on side. I do not think we should have a road user tax for electric vehicles at this point in time, and we do need to think about how that, how that actually does need to be configured as a function of time and as we transition to electric vehicles.
I think perhaps all of us might be willing to contribute something towards road use, but not the way it's been brought in, and not when electric vehicles have that significant higher upfront cost, both in state and federal taxes already on top. If you're buying a high-end electric car, you're paying a lot more for it. You're paying luxury car tax of an amount that would far outweigh a lifetime's fuel excise. and stamp duty at state level. So there's all those sort of things that have upset people. And also the proposed implementation of how do we do this? We're a state that doesn't have annual checks for registration. How is the mileage measured? There's that pretty user-friendly concept going around of live tracking us with GPS to see where we go. How does that account for private road on a farm? But, you know, like all these sort of things, it's just ridiculous. I don't think any of us want the government tracking us or a data breach of somebody else. We don't want knowing where we are or who we visit or where we shop or all that sort of thing. That kind of concept has really hit a nerve, and to single electric car owners out who are out there mostly trying to do the right thing by the community in reducing emissions feel particularly upset about that plan for implementation. So I don't know if those issues have all probably come to your attention already.
All I will say to that is that when this road user tax here in South Australia was announced, it was clear that it wasn't thought through. I'm sure they didn't consult with you guys at all.
No, we were blindsided, as I have been led to believe was the actual Department of Energy here that are left with the implementation.
Yeah, so
it seems to be the Treasurers.
This is just a thought bubble of the Treasurer, and it's not a good thought. And you know, you can try and get ahead of the game. I don't think it will go ahead, okay, because I don't think the numbers are there in the Legislative Council to pass it. However, the sorts of things you're talking to me about are probably things that you want to take to the Parliament and maybe talk about, rather than waiting to be blindsided next time, maybe get an inquiry up that looks at this. Find a committee that deals with road transport in South Australia. And I apologise, I do not know the South Australian Parliament's committee structure, but there may well be a committee that looks at these sorts of things that can delve into the topic, which would then take submissions from your organisation, the national organisation, from the car manufacturers, from the Department of Transport, Department of Energy, and you might find a better answer pops out. So you might want to think about whether or not that's something you might want to push for with the state parliamentarians.
I think we already have started doing that. By all means, nobody stop lobbying against it, if that's what you believe in. And I also think nationally we've had a lot of support from even unexpected quarters. I guess we're more interested in your take on it federally, because once it came out in South Australia, then New South Wales was thinking about it. We were watching Tasmania, didn't dare go there yet. West Australia and Queensland have said, no, we're not touching it. New South Wales has now got the wobbles. And then the last one we expected of all was the Labor government in Victoria announced it on a Saturday afternoon on a slow news day. And they're also wish to tax plug-in hybrids, which again, as Don said, would target rural and regional Australians whose best option at the moment might be a plug-in hybrid. And yet most of their mileage is going to be double taxed. South Australia said they're not going to touch PHEVs. They were initially, but they're backing away at the moment. But we need to make sure that that stays that way and it doesn't sneak in some other way. So it's the federal picture that we're interested in.
Okay, but also, I mean, going back to the state picture, because this is where this is originated from, understand the environment in which this is all being done, and that is a post-COVID world where treasuries have spent a lot of money trying to bring us through COVID-19. There's not a lot of change left in any of the piggy banks, and so that's why the states are now looking and saying, how do we address the shortfall that is coming, the deficit that will be on the books. Again, my view is that this needs to be looked at from a national perspective. Again, I have written to McCormack and to Taylor with the basically pointing this out, and I'm awaiting their response. And at that point, I can agitate in the federal parliament to make sure we do have a consistent approach, and perhaps at Senate estimates next time around we can inquire of both Treasury and Department of Energy and perhaps industry as to what is actually happening behind the scenes, and I'm happy to take that on as a task to try and get some more information for you. There's some gentleman in the back with the hand up.
Good evening, Senator. Thank you for attending. My name's Mike. Some people know me, some people are lucky they don't. Given that you're a federal politician, you'd be familiar with the Constitution. I'm not, but I believe it provides for us to travel freely. Given that, if we look at how we're now charged for ownership of vehicles, registration, insurance, but the taxes that states draw, they're currently not drawing any tax, and neither is the Commonwealth, for the movement of the vehicle. The road user tax would be the first instance of that. Is that correct? Do you here disagree with that? So my point is that you as a federal member talk to the people who know the Constitution in Parliament and ask the question about that provision and say, would this road user tax not be abhorrent to the Constitution in the sense that it prevents the movement of the vehicles? The fuel excise doesn't prevent the movement of the vehicles. The fuel excise is an excise on a liquid that we need to run the vehicle. It's not inhibiting the use of the vehicle in our choices. Sure, we could argue with fuel consumption and all that sort of thing that it represents so much. And while I'm talking about that, I also believe that haulage people running diesel get a subsidy. So the fuel excise that we're paying is subsidised for heavy industry users, and we all know about Portrush Road, the freeways, and what those vehicles do to our suburban roads. We all think it's unfair. So my point is, would you, Senator, take it upon yourself to investigate the weight that the Constitution can be used, or the weight of the Constitution that can be used to prevent a tax which is clearly designed to inhibit the movement of the vehicle on its usage, as opposed to paying for what goes into the vehicle, paying for what you need to own a vehicle, which I believe demonstrates quite clearly that state governments and the federal governments have stopped short in the past, because they could have done this ages ago, because they recognised that the Constitution, it could be argued constitutionally that's an impediment or abhorrent to that provision.
Okay, so I'm not a lawyer, although some of my colleagues in the Senate think I'm a bush lawyer. I just recently won a case against the Prime Minister and the Attorney General on a Freedom of Information request where they were represented by some barristers but ended up having to hand over documents to me. I'm currently in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. The matter is colloquially known as Rex versus Scott, and it's about my challenge to the Prime Minister just unilaterally deciding that Cabinet is anything that he wants it to be, and therefore there's secrecy over anything he wants to really examine. So, a meeting of doctors, the meeting of the AHPPC is currently somehow Cabinet in confidence, even though there's not one minister there. It's a meeting of doctors. So I'm not a lawyer. I am familiar with the Constitution. It's one of the things that gets handed to you when you first day in the Senate. And I have read a lot of the very relevant parts. And the section that you're referring to is come to prominence just recently in relation to Clive Palmer challenging the Western Australian government about access to Western Australia. Now, so the first thing I would say is that the term, as I understand it, I'm happy to take this on notice and perhaps get back to you. The term is not about free movement per se. It's about making sure that as a federation, when we came together, there was nothing that restricted people in New South Wales doing stuff in South Australia or Western Australia. And that's the context upon which I believe that particular provision of the Constitution exists. And I came across that at one stage when I very cheekily, during the drought, was proposing that there be a ban on exporting cotton, because my view is that it's the same as just exporting water. And when I went to the draft is because I wanted to ban the export of cotton that was grown in the Murray-Darling Basin. I was advised I could not do that, and I couldn't do that because the Murray-Darling Basin affects or crosses into Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, ACT and South Australia, but not the Northern Territory and not Western Australia, and the federal parliament is not allowed to make laws that apply only to particular states. So that is the difficulty. I'm pretty convinced that the provision that you're referring to is not about free movement per se, but simply making sure that as a federation, there was no advantage given to any particular state. There was freedom to do commerce across each of the states. You can't tax someone for, in South Australia, you can't tax someone in Victoria because they are in Victoria. You have to apply common standards across the Commonwealth. However, because you've brought up the Constitution, Section 109 of the Constitution basically says that when there's a law of a state that is inconsistent with a federal law, the federal law takes precedence insofar as the inconsistency exists. And that's the law by which, if the federal government were to introduce a fuel exercise or a road user charge, then in actual fact the federal government have the power to override all of the states in those circumstances, provided we have a head of power in the Constitution to make laws about road user charges. Then we can make a law that is consistent right across the country. You might know that the government is proposing to put a radioactive waste dump in Kimber. That's run into a bit of a snag in the Senate, and I've been part of that snag because I don't believe the process was run fairly or openly and properly. Others are opposing it for different reasons. I've slept on a nuclear submarine. I'm not afraid of nuclear energy at all, and I'm comfortable that it's safe, but I don't think the process was run properly there. There is a law in South Australia that says you can't have a waste dump here in South Australia. But because of Section 109 of the Constitution, the federal government has passed a law that says it will select a site, and therefore it overrides the state law. I often get confronted with people who say, but our state laws say you can't have it. Unfortunately, the Constitution, in this instance, overrides it. So that's a walk into the Constitution for all those that are still awake.
Sorry, I think Matthew's been waiting for a while there, and then we'll keep working our way around those.
Thanks for giving up your time for us tonight. I think there's a few elephants in the room about this. The excise tax on fuel is a federal tax.
That's right.
It goes straight to the federal government, and they allocate parts of it for the roads in the states. The taxes of Victoria, particularly in South Australia, are trying to introduce, they're saying it's because they're not going to get the money out of the excise from fuel that the federal government get and then pay them for their roads in the various states. It's a separate issue altogether. The problem is this.
Thanks, Mr.
Since Mr. Kennett introduced and got rid of all their utilities, they have no real income anymore except from the federal government and then South Australia from when you sell a house. They really don't. And so they're trying to slide in under the door and say, we'll introduce a state tax for using a vehicle because we're not going to get this money for our roads. It's quite illegal, it seems to me, because it's a federal tax they're trying to take over. Am I correct in that one?
Okay, so they're not being unlawful in what they're doing, and what you are absolutely correct in the way you describe the fuel excise as a federal tax enacted by the federal parliament. And one of the problems that we have with the income generated from fuel excise, and this has happened well before COVID, was, of course, every single car, even ICEs, are getting much more efficient. And so, there already was a revenue problem. It was identified. I can remember it being talked about a couple of years ago in my parliamentary discussions. So the federal government have been thinking about this. It is a federal law, but you're correct in saying, and I indicated before, state governments are looking for money post-COVID. And that's exactly the reason it's being applied. But they do have the lawful power. They have the power as a state. We are a federation, and the states are separate entities. The Crown, the Queen, here in South Australia is technically a different Queen to the Queen of Australia in a legal sense, because they are all separate. They are all separate legal entities. I've just been involved in the passing of laws in the federal parliament related to foreign affairs, where I supported these laws. There were some amendments that were made, but that allows the federal government to look at any agreement signed by a state or a university that intersects with a foreign jurisdiction. I think it's targeted at the Belt and Road Initiative signed up by the Victorian government with China, and there were constitutional questions raised when we were discussing that particular bill, because there is an acceptance from previous High Court judgments that the states have the constitutional right to interact with other jurisdictions, with other foreign countries. And so there may be some tests that flow from these laws that we have passed, and the High Court may end up having to decide what is what. But South Australia is a separate jurisdiction, separate and independent jurisdiction, and it makes laws. It does things on health, on roads, on the local councils are all set up under state laws. The federal laws are in our constitution set up by acknowledgement of Section 51 of our Constitution, which lays out all of the things that the federal government have sole responsibility for, and they include things like defence, things like corporations. Sometimes we have to exercise our power in Canberra by getting to the corporations law, which we can use to, in some sense, grant us a head of power to deal with things that might be taking places in states. But I can assure you the state government has the lawful ability, provided the Parliament wishes it, to impose a tax upon South Australians for the use of roads. Where this can get turned around, as I said before, is when the federal government says no, we're going to do that, and then Section 109 of the Constitution kicks in, and those federal laws would then override all of the state laws.
I think the other thing that I was going to mention is what Sally said. We have a member who is the Associate Professor dealing with lungs at the Royal Adelaide Hospital, who gives one of the best presentations I've ever seen in my life on anything. And he really should be allowed to come and talk to all you guys, because he sets it out, he puts the money on the board of just how much his staff will be diminished just about as soon as we don't have pollution in our cities. That will more than offset what the federal government is worried about with their taxes and their charges. I think it gets up to 60-odd% on fuel when they add everything in. It's nearly 67%, I believe. And they're worried, and they're being pushed by the oil and gas companies because they're worried sick how they're going to make up that money that they get from the ICE vehicles. But the health bill will be reduced by billions because we're not inhaling all these toxins. And if only we could get you to get this man, the associate professor, in this subject. Hubertus Jersman, yeah. It will open their eyes, because he's done it very, very, very professionally. And I think they haven't realise the savings in health, and you maybe need to talk to the health minister, because he's the man that's going to save a lot of money in his bill.
So again, look, I appreciate where you're coming from. It's no good having an associate professor or a professor in a particular field that preaches to the converted. Okay, you do have to take those sorts of people and take them to Canberra or have them visit the offices of parliamentarians here, either federal parliamentarians that are South Australian or indeed, in the case of state legislation, your own state politicians. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that. And in some sense, I guess I was hinting, the point I was making before is you can wait to be blindsided, or you can actively say, we're going to have, this is an issue, and we're going to have to lobby in relation to this. You're going to have to lobby into the political system, and all of you people are probably quite far in distance from politics, but actually that's where the decisions are made. And that's what I mean by having if you could get an inquiry up, you can get interest across a number of different players and get an inquiry up. Then what happens is the Legislative Council and indeed the Senate are really good at inquiries. We will seek submissions, or they will seek submissions from every quarter. They'll examine all of the submissions. They'll look at it from a health perspective, they'll look at it from an industry perspective, they'll look at it from a safety perspective, a whole range of different perspectives. But it's no good bringing those people to me. I'm on board. Okay, you actually have to have a strategy to take your story and influence to, in this case, the state parliament, but perhaps then replicating that with nationally with other colleagues to do the same thing in the federal space. Look, I can tell you, I've got 150 issues that probably came to my desk today, and I try and eat away at ones that I can. Some of them I just say, look, I can't help. That's a dispute between two neighbours about a fence, and a federal senator can't help in that regard. Some of the state issues where I might be able to have some influence, pick up the phone. Others, fair and square federal issues, and I triage them and I work out. Sometimes I just go, look, I agree with you, I just can't fight that particular battle. I do pick my battles. I pick my opportunity to get some funding for electric vehicles, and that was all part of that. A lot of that fell out of that Senate inquiry. That's how you inform politicians. And I've had people come to me and say, geez, wasn't that inquiry a waste of time? We got 6 recommendations and the government rejected all of them, without understanding that the real benefit was it was a way for experts to come into the Senate and talk directly and get on the record all of the issues, all of the facts. And then 2 years later, it still happens to me, 2 years later, I'll think of something. In fact, I did it today, this morning actually. I get in trouble. I consciously did this, but Google and Facebook are currently fighting it out with the federal government. The federal government, rightly in my view, want to support media outlets because that's part of a really important part of a democracy. And I made a comment to the paper saying that I think Google, who'd threatened to leave the country, had taken something out of the Chinese Communist Party's playbook. And of course that made the front page of the Australian. And Google hasn't contacted me yet, so I'm just waiting to see what happens there. But I then saw on Twitter, Quinton Dempster then tweeted something about, in Google, it sends all its advertising revenue to Singapore, and that's where they pay tax. And I thought to myself, no. I remember doing something back in fact, I remember Nick Xenophon doing something back in 2015 with Google and tax. And I went to the Hansard, I went back and had a look at the inquiry, and sure enough, Chris Jordan, the current tax commissioner, said, had stood up and said something along these lines, and I hope I say this accurately so I don't get sued, but basically he stood up and said, well, it is true that Google send their advertising money to Singapore, but what they haven't told you is that they then funnel it to companies in Bermuda through different licensing arrangements and effectively pay no tax at all. Okay, so apologies to Google if I didn't quite get that exactly right, but that's what Commissioner Gordon had said. But I use that to illustrate the point that your job is to educate the people who make decisions about this, and in some sense that's your point. And if that's why if you can get an inquiry up, that's really good. If you can't get an inquiry up, run a little team that makes representations to individual players, starting with shadow ministers. They're often easier to get access to. The independents who are desperate to make a difference wherever they can. Then working across the parties, working out who your allies are in North Terrace and who you need to work on. And that's the sort of stuff that the BHPs of this world and the mining companies and the Googles and all of the big players, they engage specialists to help them form up those strategies, but you don't need a specialist. And I'm happy to help you if you wanted to come up with a plan that said, how do we take our message to the state parliament, even though I don't know it that well. I know how the system works, making sure that you take get messages to each of the different stakeholders, and that you might require different messages to the different stakeholders. But if you sit and you do nothing, then suddenly you'll get sideswiped again. So I accept what you're saying. I don't in any way suggest that you're wrong. It would be good to hear from health experts as to the benefits of electric cars. But
You talk money.
sure.
That's all they
Well,
think about.
yes and no. Again, that's the message that you might take to the Liberal Party, because they tend to like to think of themselves as economic managers. To the Greens, you might take a slightly different message. And that's the skill of the advocacy and the strategy that you might adopt to take an issue to Parliament and make sure that every parliamentarian is well informed. Making sure Rob Lucas, the Treasurer, knew about this before he made a bad decision. Rob, if you're watching this, bad decision.
I just wanted to say, and I didn't get paid for this, if you really want to affect Parliament, I was nearly going to be a senator like you in Parliament, and when I was told I could not cross the floor, a certain party that wanted me, I was nominated and elected. I said, I will vote for what my electorate wants. I got a phone call the next week saying they were going to re-look at it again. I told them what to do with their party. But if you really want power in our systems, the Senate is the place. And you put as many independents, and if you're greenish, Greens, because they then can keep them in order. Otherwise, the two-party preferred system is really now, very, as you know, very difficult to overcome. So vote for men like this man, and I'll hit him for some money after.
No, I think I'm supposed to hit you for money. I think that's how it works, isn't it?
Thank you, Matthew. I'll just take some more comments in a second, but I did want to comment. Do you get a feeling that the federal government don't want to deal with roads funding anymore, and this is their way of pressuring the states to take it on, and this is where this has all come from, perhaps?
No, I think they're caught out. They've been caught out. The states have, as I said, looked at their balance sheets post-COVID and said, what can we do? And you're correct in saying, there's very few options. There's the stamp duty when you sell your house. There's payroll tax. A whole range of very inefficient taxes, actually. That's what state governments use to try and bolster their treasury. And of course, there's all GST gets paid to states using a particular formula, which is just recently adjusted. And South Australia may have lost out a little bit in that way, but I think it was just a thought bubble, and it's caught the federal government out. And that may explain why we haven't got a response back from the relevant ministers yet.
Yeah, we saw a document, whether you've seen it or not, that it was a thought bubble of all the treasurers nationally getting together and thinking this would be wonderful, and that's why my question was, you know, is the federal government really trying to shift that responsibility elsewhere? But we might move on. We've got a man in a blue shirt over here. We've got a couple of people over here that have had their hand up for quite some time. So we'll keep moving. And don't forget, there are other topics other than road user charges up for tonight, okay?
I won't mention road use charges.
Okay.
Thanks, Rex. My name's Graham McClay. I'm a new member. I am also a member of Doctors for the Environment, and we have met with you before. The Ministerial Forum on Vehicle Emissions was established at the end of 2015. We're 5 years on, and they've done nothing except to say that they will expect to reduce sulphur in petrol by 2027 and aromatics, some tweaking of the aromatics in fuel by 2022. And a number of people have alluded to the health aspects tonight, and it's been totally ignored. We've known about the noxious agents in ice vehicle exhaust. We've known about that for more than 20 years, and the briefing paper for the Ministerial Forum actually set it out very, very well. So that they really have got no excuse for ignoring the health issues. And the same goes for electric buses. Why would the state choose diesel buses when we know that those diesel emissions are giving kids asthma, and we know that air pollution, which is partly transport and partly other things, it's coal emissions and so on, but transport plays a big part and is responsible for more deaths than the road toll in Australia. So we made submissions about this, several submissions, and yet one suspects the hand of Appiah in this. I don't know, you might know better than that, but can you tell me what's become of the Ministerial Forum?
Okay, so for people who might not know what a Ministerial Forum is, generally it is a meeting of the Federal Minister and all of the State Ministers looking at a particular area or portfolio. We have them for water, for example, for the Murray-Darling. We have them for building codes, vehicle emissions is one area that has been looked at by these forums. I've actually FOI'd the minutes of a couple of those meetings, and I'd be happy to make those available to you. I will say that it is often a struggle because you're trying to get 7 jurisdictions to agree on something, and they all come with their own particular perspective. You know, water's a classic example where Queensland and New South Wales, they're actually quite happy to take as much water out of the river as they possibly can and still pretend that they care about the entire river system. And the South Australian Minister has a different problem when he goes into those forums. What I'll say to you, and this goes to what I said about how I triage issues that come to me, as a senator responsible for all portfolios, every piece of legislation that comes through the Senate as an independent, I often sit with my Liberal or Labor colleagues when we're voting on something. I'll often look across and say, "Do you know what you're voting on?" I have no idea. They just walk in and see where the whip is directing them to sit on the yay or the nay side, and they simply don't know, which is one of your frustrations in terms of running for the Senate. That's how it works. The decisions are made by caucus or by the cabinet, and everyone else has to follow. That's not the case for independents, but again, addressing that sort of problem, there's a few ways you can do things. You can actually come to someone like me, and if I've got time, I might take that on. You can go to a federal Liberal senator. They probably may make an inquiry, but won't push too loud because it is a Liberal government, Liberal national government, and they're not like me, who's quite happy to jump in the media and call them out if they're not responding or if I think something is wrong. The Labor Party at this point in time can often be a good source to put pressure on. You've got to find a champion inside the Parliament. But there are other ways that you can do things yourself. The way in which my formal roles under the Constitution, I have two major tasks. One of them is to review and modify and pass or not pass legislation. So legislation is one of my jobs. The other job I have is oversight of government on your behalf. The way it works is I'm voted by you guys, so this is people power, you give it to me, and that gives me powers through the Constitution to ask questions of government and expect answers. And they technically have to answer. Sometimes they'll dodge around for a while, and that's. You could come to me, I could go and ask some questions. I can put a question on notice, as I did today, put a question on notice. Someone contacted my office and said, can you try and, I can't seem to find out how many reserve people there are in the Army, Navy and Air Force in South Australia. So I've put a question to the Minister. I'll find that out for that person. I can do that for you if you have particular questions that might draw out particular issues or highlight deficiencies for which I can then take a next step. But you're also empowered yourself, and you are empowered by things like freedom of information laws. In South Australia, the Freedom of Information Act 1999. In the case of the federal jurisdiction, the Freedom of Information Act 1982. That gives you a legally enforceable right to documents and information held by government. Because the way it works is they don't do anything that they don't do on your coin and for public purpose, and you are entitled to see what it is they're doing. There are exceptions to that, so there are exemptions for national security grounds, for example, something that might affect a current police operation, something that might cause commercial harm. There are some legitimate exceptions, and people don't use that power enough. I can tell you it's really simple for, particularly in the federal space, there's no charge, to simply write an email that says to the FOI officer, Department of Energy, I seek access. This email is an application for the purpose of the FOI Act 1982. I seek access to these documents. Send. That puts in place a request which must be answered, must be responded to within 30 days. I've had the Cooper Pedy Council trying to get access to a water infrastructure document that the state government or that SA Water holds, and I spoke to the council. They said, "Well, we've asked the government for it." I simply then went away and wrote an email, much the same way I described it, to the state government. There is a charge at the state level. As an MP, I don't pay that charge, but it's not a big charge, and I've now FOI'd that, and I expect a response. I expect that document to either land on my desk on the 9th of February, or it will land in a redacted way. Either way, for me, it's okay. I'll either get the document or I'll get some government secrecy story, which will end up in the paper. So I win whichever way it goes. But I then, if I suspect that someone is withholding a document from me, in an unreasonable manner, I then take it to either the Information Commission of the AAT, or in the case of a South Australian FOI, to the Ombudsman or to SACAT. But I'm not special. I'm not treated any differently when I put on the application Senator Patrick than if you put Mr. Smith. You have the same exact rights as what I have to request access to documents. And again, if any of you want to do that, you feel like you want to get access to the minutes of those meetings, you are legally entitled to them. They may advance some exemptions to them. The great thing is when you fight exemptions, because the law grants a positive right for you to have them, and I normally go through this process. I go to the department, they tend to redact things and hold things back. I then appeal it to an independent commissioner where they have to argue to that commissioner why I can't have that document. It's a positive right, and the responsibility then falls on the department. So if you're prepared to have a bit of a go, my office will help you with that. I've got an expert in my office called Max, who is almost my FOI officer. I as a senator I think I've done about 200 and something of FOIs. I've got it's probably more than that with the Information Commissioner. I have about 4 or 5 matters in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, one in which I've just won against the Prime Minister. In fact, the score when I've taken things to appeal is Rex Patrick 6, Government 0. So if you can get it to an independent body, you can have a good crack at it, and I'm happy to help people if they want to do that. But people do not use that often enough. If you want to understand what the government is doing, you are entitled to know because they work for you. That's the way it works.
Hello. Just on the Senate inquiry on electric vehicles, there was a recommendation there about to do a charging network, which obviously didn't go too far, other than the arena giving some money for the charging network. But the charging network seems to have all been, it's Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane is the path. Any chance you can sort of pressure arena for money for charging, fast chargers in, we've got the Perth, Adelaide, Perth, obviously Adelaide, Darwin, but that inner Australia charging network?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to talk about that. Of course, I note in the South Australian plan, there is a plan for a charging network to be in place by, I think it's 2025. Nonetheless, ARENA generally gets involved in projects that involve some nascent technology that needs a bit of a kick along, and that's trying something out. So it might be someone who's got a charger and wants to go to a fast charger. ARENA can often help them bridge the gap. So there are 2 entities inside the Commonwealth that fund these sorts of things. One of them is ARENA, and again, they look at R&D style projects, and the other organisation is the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, who have about, I think it's $10 billion that has been allocated to them to invest in clean energy projects. Unlike ARENA, where you might get a grant, which is always nice, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation basically lend money to people where they can't get finance elsewhere at perhaps a slightly cheaper rate to help get a project across the line. In principle, those organisations are independent. So what happens is if you have a proponent that wants assistance from ARENA, they will make application, and the application will go through a particular process that does involve scrutiny by a technical panel and so forth. But that doesn't stop someone like me, and I have absolutely done this in the past, turning up to Senate estimates, which happens 4 times or 3 times a year, and arena appear before me, and I might say, how's this particular project going? And that's the sort of, it's an oversight pressure. Some of these bodies, we've got to be careful. We don't want to do sports rorts. We don't want to have decisions made on the basis of margins in different electorates around the country. But we have a process, and again, my office has also helped people make applications to ARENA in the case of a proponent who wants to advance a particular project.
Okay, because I was going to say some of the regional EV chargers are going to need some smart technology, PV batteries, because they're not going to have the grid capacity to do fast charging. So there's a lot of R&D that's got to really happen to put in EV chargers in rural Australia, and it can be done, but just no one's really put up the money.
Yeah, look, I think there's certainly, during that inquiry, we visited a place in Brisbane where they were building fast chargers for export to Europe, actually, places like Norway, which is people who know Europe, they'll know the EV uptake in Norway is fantastic. I don't know whether you've looked at what they are doing. There should be some motive in there for them to do these sorts of things if they can sense, smell, and I have no problem with this, smell a profit, smell a commercial return from expanding their product range. I'm sure they will. The point is, and I say this to lots of people come to me with great ideas, but you have to have someone who has skin in the game, has the business acumen, and the technical capabilities to do something like that. Then you come to my office, and I then look to say, how do I help you get access to federal funding? I generally won't help an individual because individuals will always fail the tests that government place upon people before they give them money. ACE vehicles is having to go through some of that now to make sure properly that we never give taxpayers money away unless without looking at the risk profiles of companies.
Was there someone else back here that had their hand up? What was that? I'll just say there's a few other things federally, obviously, where the fringe benefits tax would apply to workplace charging, to soak up all that lovely solar surplus in the middle of the day and take it home and redistribute it to peak hour. Is that something that could be considered federally, like as an incentive, not taxing that? To encourage people to buy an electric car and charge it at work. I don't mean from the solar panels. Businesses that put up solar panels usually use all that power within their business, but the general, particularly in South Australia, but other states have a solar surplus in the middle of the day. It's sort of a federal thing. The other couple that I've been given on my list to mention tonight were that electric scooters. Now,
can I just so I don't get too far, I'll just say that first question is a question without notice that requires notice. Okay. So I haven't really thought about that. It's the first time someone's raised that with me. So thank you.
Yep. If workplaces allowed that charging at work, do they have to charge the person for it if they allow them to take it home? And with bi-directional charging coming in at home, would it not work very efficiently, or could it be made to work as an incentive, which we think would be great, and it contributes to energy management security rather than working against it. But another couple of questions that have come to us: electric scooters, that last mile, I think they're small trip hazards around the city footpaths, but there are lots of other small personal motorised devices, electric powered devices now. Legal in Queensland, not legal in other states. Couldn't we get a national ruling on this and encourage that sort of thing? And along with that is some other countries in the world, America and Europe, what are called neighbourhood electric vehicles. They're small, speed limited, but you still need a driver's licence. They're not just golf carts, they're a step up from that. How about getting some trials federally for that? That would help low-income earners into the EV era. It could be used in, perhaps regional towns like Goolwa, or trialled in perhaps Unley, we've suggested, like a low, 40-kilometre-hour zone for local transport to train stations, bus hubs, etc. that would all contribute to the transition to the EV era and include more people in that. They were suggestions. We mightn't have time to talk about them tonight. And I know Zach wants to say something as well. Zach chairs the Tesla Owners Club in South Australia, so we invited them along.
I think my question sort of follows on from the investment side of things. I won't bang on about the tax anymore, but
I've taken a particular message away tonight, okay? So.
Following on from the investment side, you mentioned that you need the technical skill as well to drive corporate and commercial investment. It was seen when the CSIRO got cut and all of its funding got cut out of the gut, that a lot of the expertise moved overseas. A lot of that expertise is now in the car that I drive, but I don't pay for that. It doesn't come back to Australia. How do you see the educational side, and is there a plan around that to manage and make sure that we have people here to drive that investment?
Okay, so a few different things in the mix there. When I worked for Nick Xenophon, I was involved with Nick in Nick's office when the car industry shut down here, and during one of the omnibus bill negotiations, and I can't remember exactly which one was which, we did things like got funding for solar reserve up in Port Augusta, whereby a new technology that had not just clean energy but also persistence. So heating a molten substance and that retaining the energy, and then that energy being used at night time. We also did a number of things. One of the things that we did was we got some funding for two aftermarket houses. So the government was doing a lot of funding to transition people out of the automotive sector. What Nick and I was involved in negotiations, what we did was, I might just step away and just speak up. What we did was we said there's a problem that we have to solve because there are people that want to stay in the market, except they can't now sell their product to the Holdens and Toyotas of this world. So we got some funding. I've already opened up a facility in Melbourne for aftermarket people to come and pool their resources so they can basically bring a car in from overseas, and each of the different aftermarket suppliers can effectively use that car to put a tow bar on something, or to put shockers, different shock absorption system on the car. But one of the other things we did was we organised for some funding for graduate engineers who, as they got through their course, were looking at what they were going to do afterwards, and some of them said, "Well, there's no future in the automotive industry." What we did was we put in a scholarship that said to some of these good engineers, there is a future in automotive, and here's some money that will go towards your college fees to help you along to try and keep people in the automotive sector. That's one of the things that we did. So trying to skew people into that domain. Look, I was involved in a vote last year, quite controversial. I voted against the government as they tried to jack up prices, in some case doubling the costs of certain degrees, which I just think is just awful for the very institutions that create our future. All the time we're looking at ways with R&D funding, with education funding, to make sure we have the expertise, and looking for that value add again as well as the place where you move away from driving a truck that picks up rocks to actually processing stuff and doing so in a smart way. If it might be Sanjeev Gupta up in Whyalla using clean, generating or moving down a pathway to have green steel, setting up electric solar farms all over South Australia, all over near Whyalla, Port Augusta, wind farms and so forth. That takes some vision, some coordination and planning. Unfortunately, I don't think it's all there with the federal government. We tend to be quite, well, I tend to see ad hoc behaviour. My job is oversight in those sorts of things, and where possible to oppose increases in university fees. The government was seeking to try and save $1 billion in the university sector, in circumstances where, and this is, I'm glad you're all sitting down. We've got a future submarine project, which I fully support as an ex-submariner, but its cost went from $50 billion to $89 billion over 3 years. Just the blowout cost is costing the Australian taxpayer $2.8 million per day for the next 38 years. And you just think, what could I do with that money if the submarine project was actually run properly and perhaps with less risk, less ambition, and probably a better outcome, because you don't end up with a submarine like we had with the Collins class submarines, which work now after a lot of money has been spent on them, but they were what were called paper tigers. On paper, they looked like they were going to be the best submarines in the world, but when they were first delivered, they were not. The future submarine project, that is, amongst friends here, you'll understand this, the worry that I have about this. A question on notice I put to Rear Admiral Samet. What sort of battery are you going to find in the future submarine? And it's not lithium, it's going to be lead acid. The only place you're going to be able to find a lead acid cell in 2035 when the submarine is delivered is in the future submarine or in a museum. And yet we are paying top dollar for this particular project. We're not meeting local content obligations. So part of what I try, and I stand up in the Senate quite regularly, and I will be talking about some funding of some sort, and I'll raise the future submarine project, and I can see the deputy president of the Senate looking at me saying I'm going to have to rule him out of order because he's not talking about the topic subject to debate. But I always link it back to why are we debating a road user tax, and we spend a week debating it, and the Defence Department just says, oh, it's gone up another $10 billion, and no one even cares. No one even looks at it. And when I do that, I actually take a bit of pleasure at it now. I'll look across at Simon Birmingham and I'll say, what are you doing about it? And he won't look me in the eye. He'll look some other direction, and because they actually don't know what to do about it. That's quite a long-winded response, and I'm not sure I got to where you wanted to be. But we do need a strategy that looks at those sorts of things, that involves a whole range of things, like creating the job opportunities in that value-add space, making sure that people are properly educated as they move into there, and recognising that I see this I'm doing some stuff with sawmills here in South Australia, where the state government, SA Forestry, have taken. When they're selling log from Mount Lofty, they look for the best price. Now, the best price is coming from, was until just very recently, from Chinese sawmills. They can afford to pay more than the South Australians can because they have no costs when they produce, when they do the value add. So they pay more. And SA Forestry, even though their charter says something different, often will say we're going to go for price without considering value, which is the value of sending those slightly less, those logs that give a slightly less return, that go to Jamestown to a sawmill that employs 50 people, and and adds value and pays tax, and it keeps the town going. Okay, you get it. Okay, you get it. I get it. You all get it. Unfortunately, we don't see a lot of politicians that get it, and that is sad. Oh, sorry, Sally's running the show.
We are going to have to be quick. Have you got a statement? Yeah? Walk up. While you're getting here, I might make the comment that all of this seems to be the same issue in that road user charges, the charging networks, they're all state-based policies. And what we're clearly lacking in Australia is a federal EV transition policy. Is that what you're going to say?
No, I've got something a bit light-hearted.
And that's we have had the Senate inquiry, AEVA nationally and this state made submissions. We make submissions to the state government here, which they have listened to quite a lot of what we have to say. But how do we get a good federal policy?
We asked for that in the letter, didn't we? Where is the plan?
Yeah, we have.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what we've asked, and actually in that letter, to answer the other gentleman's question regarding the charging network, so it came out of the previous inquiry, it's been rolled into the infrastructure priority list, and it's still sitting there. It's been in there now for a year and a bit. It just says it's looking for a proponent. So part of the question to Minister McCormack was exactly that. Very specifically, this is an infrastructure issue. Where are you at?
Yeah.
Where is the national plan? If you don't get up and start this national plan, we're going to end up with a bloody rail problem. You've got to jump in. And the moment the federal government jumps in, as the boss said, now you've got federal government setting up, it's really hard for the states to do anything.
Yes.
And to come back to what you were talking about, the road user charges, okay, that forum, federal treasurer does not sit in it. That's the council of treasurers, it's just state.
Yeah.
Federal can be an observer, so that's really being done at the state level. If there was any collusion between them, don't know, but if we can get the federal government up
Yes.
and doing something, then it will stop the states from doing what they're doing.
All right, thank you. And just a bit of you're still waiting, Terry, I know. I think most of you know that this branch this year is holding AEVA's National Conference and Expo in late October. No one is allowed to go anywhere else than other than be there. No one in this room, that's for sure. And as we're currently seeking state government support or funding for that conference and expo, today I received a reply to our initial request from the Department of Energy and Mining, and on their wish list is to have a Formula E car on display. Obviously, we've made submissions supporting motorsport. It's a great innovator, anything in that direction is a great thing. My response has been to point out that there are none currently held in Australia. Formula E don't want to bring them here unless they actually run a race that they can compete in, and that the cost to ship one over to put it on display is so astronomical that we could have at least a 50 kilowatt tritium and some AC charging in every single country town in the state for less than the cost of putting that car on display. It's very similar to your story, and that would be a far better use of government money.
Sure.
Anyway, Terry, your turn.
Hi, my name's Terry. Thanks for coming. You mentioned Formula E, so Sally stole some of my thunder. When can we expect Formula E to replace the supercars?
Okay, so I've only really just started engaging this. Remember, again, I'm a crossbencher who takes on one thing at a time, so that I can at least get as far as I can with something. And I typically go for 80 or 90%, not for 100, because you spend too long on that. My object is never to make the world perfect, but just to make it better. I have sat down. I have been briefed on this. My understanding is actually the Premier is in favour of the event taking place here. When I say that, I'm not going to verbal him and suggest that he's going to sign off on something. Just that his mind is open to the proposition. You might know that there was a Tourism Australia, South Australia did a feasibility study looking at running Formula E here. Interestingly, the various groups have said, well, the state government hasn't released that report. Well, in about 29 days, because I think I lodged it yesterday, there's an FOI request in because I know my rights. And again, if they don't get it to me, it'll be in the Tiser or somewhere, secrecy, government secrecy. But I'll take it to SACAT, and I will get most of it released to me. I'm confident, because it won't involve anything that's commercially sensitive in any great detail. But it's a funny thing. When they shut down the Air Peninsula railway, there was a study that had been done called the Air Peninsula Freight Study, looking at trucks and trains and so forth. And again, lots of people said, oh, we just can't get the study. And so I FOI'd it using the laws that you can use at any stage. And it was released to me 30 days later. On the day that it was released to me under FOI, the state government released it publicly as well. So that stole my thunder in terms of perhaps doing some sort of, giving it to a journo to do something exclusive on it. But I don't care. At the end of the day, we got the document. We got to see what was in it. So my next step. So I've talked to people. I've actually also made some suggestions. I think one of the problems you've got is you've got a whole bunch of advocates. A little bit about the advice I was giving you guys before. You've got a bunch of advocates who are saying, Sam Shaheen will put in some money. We've got this company that will put in money. But if I said to someone, can you show me the commitments? They can't. And I don't think a state government will ever make a commitment until you get all of those people lined up and with letters that say, subject to South Australian government support, we will contribute to the event. When you've got that together, then you can go in and it's a much easier lobbying case. Okay, rather than starting at the state government end, and that's the suggestion I've given to some of the proponents of the Formula E.
Will those people be mentioned in this FOI you've asked for?
I don't know. The study was done. It was finished in February this year. Okay. February last year, and I have now formally requested it, using my legally enforceable right under Freedom of Information laws, because that study was funded by the government, by you.
Will you share that?
Absolutely, absolutely. Once I get it, in whatever state, I'm happy to share that with you. As I said, it might come out completely redacted.
We want the unredacted bit that you get after.
Well, that's okay. No, so what happens is I will then, if it is unreasonably unredacted, I'm pretty good at picking when I'm going to win these things. As I said, my score's 6-0. I will take it to SACAT, and I will argue that because a lot of the exemptions require have a public interest test as well that can override the exemption as well. So I often will try and strike out the exemption, saying that is not commercially sensitive just because it names a company. But if that fails, I'll say, nonetheless, it is in the public interest to release the document for these reasons, and I will, and all my FOIs, I make available to anyone and everyone who wants access to them because they belong to you. Funnily enough.
Thank you. Well, with it.
So.
Okay, well, I think we've gone a little bit past time, but it's been a pretty interesting discussion all round. I think I'd like you all, I'm sure you will join me in thanking Senator Rex Patrick for giving us and perhaps unsurprisingly, he may start receiving a bit more correspondence from us than he previously did, just to add to his list of tasks.
Look, I'm keen to help. Well, again, what I will say is I tend to do things one at a time. So I'll just say to you, which is the most important and which one do we think will get the most likely result, and I'll work on that. And when we finish that, I'll move to the next piece. So right now, my piece is get that document, and then we'll see what happens next. But I'm happy to do stuff in the federal space as well. Senate estimates 3 times a year. Any Commonwealth official can be called before the Senate. Sometimes if they're lower down, I might have to personally request them through the committee process and say I want to speak to that particular person because they have the expertise that I want. But I have the ability to directly question officials. I have that ability because I have a power that is granted to me by you through the Constitution.
Thank you very much for coming along.